Hi, I'm Lydia and I've been coming to Chelmsford Vineyard for nearly 6 years now, and along with my husband Matt we lead the youth. So I was asked to speak on something that God had been speaking to me about recently, and to be honest it has to come from the book of Ruth in the Old Testament of the Bible. And in fact I would really encourage you to go away and read the book of Ruth after this, and even if you've read it before, it's only 4 chapters long and it takes about 25 minutes to read at a leisurely pace, but it's just so good. And me and the girls read it whilst we were in lockdown during mentoring, and we were just like desperate to read the next bit every week to see how God moved in crazy and wonderful ways. So yeah, if you need encouragement to read the Bible at the moment, this is a great place to start. Okay, so the book of Ruth is a book for people who wonder where God is in times of tragedy, difficulty, when life just seems like one hard slog after the other. The book of Ruth is a story for people who wonder if, when life seems tough, whether a life of integrity is even worth it. It's a story for those who may look at their life at times and wonder if anything extraordinary could come from their seemingly boring, ordinary lives. And most of all, I would argue, it's a book for people who have lost sight of where God is moving or working in their life. Anyone other than me fall into any of those categories? Life has its ups and downs, and right now you might feel like life is really good, or you might feel like the last few months have been really hard, where God might just seem absent and you are finding it tough. Either way, the book of Ruth and the message it gives us will be of encouragement to you, so it's well worth a read. Now, I've struggled not to preach on the entire story of Ruth and to just pick one part, as it's all really great, but stick with me. And when reading this, one theme particularly stood out, and that's the theme of God's providence. So what actually is God's providence? Well, it's not a simple concept, and people write whole books on it alone. But maybe if we think of it as God's involvement, his active and present hand in our lives, working for our good towards his purposes. The problem with providence is that often we don't see it. We don't see his intervention or the hand of God in our lives and where he was actually working until the event has already passed. And that can be really tough. And this is where we'll begin looking at the story of Ruth. So let me set the scene. The story takes place during the time of Judges, and this was a 400-year period after Israel had entered the Promised Land under Joshua. And basically, this was a time in history where there was no king in Israel. So every man did what was right in his own eyes. There was no kind of common morale, and there was a lack of morals. And people were actively sinning and rebelling against God over and over again. And what the book of Ruth does is give us a glimpse of the hidden work of God during these seemingly hopeless times. So our story begins with a single family, Naomi and her husband Elimelech, and their 2 sons Mahlon and Chilion. They live in Judah, and right now there's a serious famine, and the family decide to leave Judah, God's promised land, and go to a place called Moab. Now, I've never been in a famine, and I've certainly never been in that kind of situation with children, so I don't feel like I can judge their decision. But Moab was a pagan land with pagan and foreign gods. And so this was a bit of a dodgy move, as God had kind of called his people to be separate from those kind of places. So they made a decision that was going against what God had asked of them. So when they moved there, and then when Naomi's husband Elimelech dies, you can't blame her for feeling as if it was a bit like the judgment of God had followed her, that kind of thing. However, their sons then found Moabite wives, one called Orpah and one called Ruth. So Naomi now had 2 daughter-in-laws. Though the grief didn't stop there. Chapter 1 verse 5 tells us that both Mahlon and Chilion then die. So now Naomi has lost her 2 sons and her husband. Gosh, massive loss after massive loss. And this is where we'll start to read from. So if you have a Bible, please turn to Ruth chapter 1 verse 6. And if you don't, I would really encourage you to download the Bible app and look it up on there now. Okay, so chapter 1 verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing them food, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home to Judah. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept out loud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "No, return home. Why would you come back with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if I still thought there was hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord has turned his hand against me." Wow, what a hopeless situation. Naomi has been through just about everything. Right now, she feels like God has literally turned away from her. I think the importance of this passage is that it really highlights and emphasises her misery. She's literally saying that she has nothing to offer them, that her condition is worse than theirs, and if they stay with her, they will miss out on life. She's pretty much decided that her life is already over. Now, this is an extreme situation, but hopeless situations aren't foreign to us, are they? And I think sometimes when we have decided that God is against us, or maybe that he's ignoring us or ignoring our plea for something, it is easy to become bitter, so bitter that we can't start to see the rays of light peeping through where God is beginning to prepare a good work. For example, the very fact that God stopped the famine in Judah so that she could return home from this land where she had lost everything, back to the land where she had familiarity, grounding, and perhaps a wider support network. Anyway, back to the story. Orpah, one of the daughter-in-laws, decides to leave and kisses her mother-in-law goodbye. But the passage says Ruth clung to her. Naomi tries again to tell Ruth it's not worth it. But then Ruth says in verse 16, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn my back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." What a committed young lady. She's likely to be around 25 at this point, and she is literally committing her whole life to Naomi. I heard one preacher say that the commitment she makes to Naomi is like more than the commitment we make in marriage. In marriage, we say, "Till death do us part," but she's saying, "Where you die, I will die." This is a crazy commitment, and to a land where she knows nothing about, a new language, new customs, giving up her gods for Naomi's God, leaving her own mother and father, and embracing this life of widowhood and childlessness. Ruth's integrity is something to be inspired to, is it not? So Ruth and Naomi return home to Judah, and she's surprised when there's like a stir. Can this be Naomi? And they say, and Naomi tells them, No, you don't call me Naomi anymore. Naomi means pleasant. You should call me Mara, because Mara means bitter. And she says in verse 20, the Lord Almighty has made my life very bitter. And in 21 she continues, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has inflicted me. The Lord Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Now we have a lesson to learn from Naomi here. Now I am not going to lay into her for moaning. I cannot imagine what she's been through, and her moaning actually reveals that Naomi has a great theology. For a start, she has an unshaken certainty that God exists, and he is sovereign and he is powerful. However, what she has forgotten is that God promises to use all things for our good, and her keeping her faith is helpful to her seeing this. What she had forgotten is the story of Joseph, for example, from the Bible, that would have been orally repeated and spoken about all the time in those days. The story of a guy whose own brothers sold him into slavery. He was framed for adultery, put into prison, and along with Naomi could have easily said, the Lord has made my life bitter. But he kept his faith, and God turned the situation around for his personal good, and later Israel's national good. That is providence right there. God's hand at work in our lives in a situation that just seems so hopeless. So where is God working in Naomi's situation? I think it's important that we stop to look. Well, firstly, it was God who took the famine away from Judah and opened up a way home. Not only this, but importantly, it wasn't just at any time of year, it was at the beginning of the barley harvest, and this will become important in a bit. Secondly, people recognised her. What a blessing! When all other family of Naomi's had died, she had recognisable faces back home. And thirdly, Ruth. The Lord has brought you Ruth, Naomi. He hasn't brought you back empty, he brought you back with Ruth. And we will only see in just a few minutes how God's hand was all over that. Now here's the spoiler, and I'm sorry, but it's unavoidable. The biggest and craziest thing of all in this story is that in her hopelessness, Naomi had forgotten all about Boaz. Boaz was a relative on Naomi's husband's side, and he was called what was known as the kinsman's redeemer of the family. Which was a male relative who, according to various laws, had the privilege or responsibility to act for a relative who was in trouble, danger, or in need of vindication. And this sometimes involved marrying a widow to protect the wider family's property and keep the wealth, that kind of thing. Now, you really need to go and read the story of Ruth for yourself to get all the amazing details. But long story short, Boaz was a wealthy landowner who had lots of workers who harvested his field for him. Now Ruth, knowing that her and Naomi had no food, volunteered to gather the leftover barley behind the workers. Now Ruth, unknowingly, happens to go into the fields that Boaz owns. Now not even Naomi remembered about Boaz, so this was purely chance. Or was it God? Now Boaz starts to notice Ruth, and he's kind to her and tells his workers to leave more barley behind for her. Boaz knew and loved the Lord, and he made sure Ruth was protected from being harmed by the other men. Now this is a whistle-stop tour, but when Ruth keeps coming home with all this barley, Naomi has to question, who is this lovely field owner that's being so generous to you? Of which Ruth then tells him it's Boaz. Only then does Naomi click that Boaz is one of the family's kinsman's redeemers, i.e. a relative who has the responsibility to help the family out, right? So lots of incredible stuff happens in between that I can't go into right now, but the story eventually ends with Boaz marrying Ruth. Now, the implication of this is huge. In the first passage we read, Naomi paints the image of a life for Ruth of widowhood, and yet Ruth finds a husband later in Boaz, who is not only a wealthy landowner who can provide for Naomi and Ruth, two widows, but is also a man of God who is honest and loving and loyal. Secondly, Ruth's commitment to stay with Naomi means that she would be giving up the opportunity to have children. And yet in chapter 4 verse 13 it says, "So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive and she gave birth to a son." Joy was restored to that family. Naomi's family line could continue. New birth, new life and hope. Now we are left with a far more hopeful image of Naomi holding her new grandson Obed with Ruth and Boaz, surrounded by her friends who are praising God and saying, "Praise be to God that he has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew you in your old age and sustain you. For your daughter-in-law who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." And this son, he was no ordinary son either. This son was called Obed. And Obed was the father to Jesse, who was the father to King David, who led Israel to her greatest heights of glory, and ultimately was in the line of Jesus. And all this through a single family who made a wrong decision, whose life seemed hopeless. See, this is the message of providence, that God is at work even in the hardest of times, even when we've decided to go our own way or actively rebelled against God. God can and does plot for our good. And this story shows us that God's hand at work is sometimes very hard to see in the midst of hard times. So how do we look out for it? Because we can see it in Ruth and Naomi's life. How do we look out for it, the hand of God in our own lives? So firstly, I would actually argue it's a discipline. Now, if you're like me, I struggle with discipline, especially when it comes to sweet things and reading. I can never resist sweet, and I never had the discipline to finish a whole book. And I'm really sorry for the bookworms that I've just offended, but discipline is tough. But the discipline to seek out where God is working in your life, particularly when you're not feeling he is a discipline that I would argue is really worth practicing. It's about seeking out those times where you stop and you pause and you say, no, that wasn't just a coincidence. That was God in the finer detail showing me favour because he loves me. Maybe it was that you got a full night's sleep because the baby didn't wake, or you got the one last free trolley in Aldi because you forgot your £1 coin. Or maybe your friend happened to text you to see if you were okay at the exact time that you were in tears. Or you got a tax rebate just when you needed it. Or that your teachers at school happened to teach on the topic that day that you had been stressing about all week because you just didn't get it. All these things are just glimmers of God moving and working for our good, even if you can't see the bigger picture yet. You can trust these little things. Now, Ravi Zacharias says this about providence. God alone can weave a pattern from the disparate threads of our lives, whether suffering, success, joy or heartache, and fashion a magnificent design. Perhaps today, if we stop and reflect on it, you will see that the Father is seeking to weave a beautiful tapestry in your life. So let's be disciplined and stop and reflect and see his hand at work. But what if I can't even see the blessings, the good things in my life? What if I feel that stuck, that depressed and anxious and traumatised by something that has happened in my life, and it all just feels so hopeless? Well, the second thing I would suggest, besides talking to God, is actually reading the Bible. The Bible is full of stories and examples. Joseph, for one, that I mentioned earlier, but stories of individuals whose lives look desperate at times, but in whose lives you can see how God never stopped working, to turn the situation around for their good and the good of others. The cross being the biggest example of all. Tortured and abandoned, Jesus experienced the most excruciating pain, betrayal and sacrifice. And yet we look back on that event as a triumph. And why? Because through all that, God was reconciling the world to himself that day through Jesus. Romans 8 verse 28 says, "And we know that in everything God works for the good of those who love him." And this is what we need to hold on to and be encouraged by. It's these stories that should help us to trust that God is for us, he did it for them, and he does it for us. And especially we must look to the cross, as this is the ultimate way that Christ has already provided for us. Everything might feel like it's going wrong, and we may not be able to see the blessings in the present, but through the cross, God has provided everything we could ever need. Rescue, salvation, forgiveness, grace, and love. And when we doubt that God loves us, when we doubt God's love, we must come back to the cross. And importantly, I do think I need to add that God working for our good doesn't always mean we'll get our happy ending where we end up with everything how we think, and that Ruth and Boaz kind of ending. In the story of Ruth, Boaz is a Christ-like figure in how that he redeems the hopeless situation and brings the women out of the misery that they were in and gives them a future and a hope. And in that story, he is that Christ-like figure that shows us that is what Christ has done for all of us. He redeemed us on that cross, and he redeems the situations we are in, and he gives us a future and a hope that is greater than just this life. And it may not be that we feel like we get that happy ending or that great resolution that Ruth got this side of heaven, but we have both heaven to look forward to and continued intimacy and relationship with the Father right here, right now. As one friend says, it's not just pie in the sky, but steak on your plate while you wait. So a great quote that a friend pointed out to me was a quote from Corrie ten Boom, a Christian who was sent to a concentration camp in World War II for hiding Jews. And she said, "When a train goes through a tunnel and it gets dark, you don't throw away the ticket and jump off. You sit and you trust the engineer. And in the same way, we are called to trust God, our engineer, in the hard, dark times, or even just trusting him in the direction that life is heading, when it's either different to the one that you thought, or it's new, like you might be going off to uni or taking a gap year, and this whole thing is new and you don't really recognise the direction where your life is heading. It's about trusting the engineer. And we can trust him, because like Boaz, he is our kinsman redeemer. So what has my big ramble of the story of Ruth been about? Well, this story reminds us that when you think or feel God is far from you, he is actually laying the foundations for something far bigger and for your personal good, and maybe even the good of others around you. John Piper puts it beautifully. Who would have imagined that in the worst of all times, the period of the Judges, God was quietly moving in the tragedies of a single family to prepare the way for the greatest king of Israel? But not only that, he was working to fill Naomi and Ruth and Boaz and their friends with great joy. If anything is going on in your life right now that feels hopeless or just hard, whether COVID has affected your future in a negative way or caused you grief beyond despair, or even if you wouldn't say it's that big, but you just don't feel like God has much in store for your ordinary life, or maybe you feel disappointment about your current life, then I really hope you take encouragement from the story of Ruth, that God is working right now for you, to give you a future and a hope, and that his hand is always at work, even if sometimes you have to work to see it. And I would love to pray with you. Father God, we thank you that you are Lord of all, the Lord that is sovereign and powerful and yet so intricately involved in the intimacies of our life. A God that loves us and cares about us and knows the desires of our hearts. And God, I pray that you would speak to everyone watching this now, that you would meet us all in whatever circumstances we find ourselves in, and that we would know and see your present and active hand at work in our lives, and that through that we would know your love for us and your sovereignty more than ever. Amen.